You are listening to Down Home. Errol Sharpe is a trailblazer. He was involved in publishing books about BIPOC Canadians when it wasn't fashionable, way before the social justice memes and before the hashtags. Errol's contributions to the Canadian publishing scene are well regarded. He was awarded the 2021 Ivy Award for his work in the industry. He's also the father of a good friend to me and Jay and the Down Home podcast, Lindsay Sharpe. Errol has given us a bit of his time to talk about diversity in the publishing industry and his time in the North End of Halifax.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, simple breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground, yeah. On a high plateau from the one down below to the future.
Welcome to Down Home, the Nova Scotian experience from two black men. I'm Derek Wise, and as always, we have Jay Jones.
What's happening?
And our conversation this week is with award-winning author and publicist, Errol Sharpe. Mr. Sharpe, how you doing today?
I'm doing fine.
Awesome. That is great. That is great. Now,
I'm doing great.
You've been involved in the publication of books for a very long time, and so you've seen a lot of things. In your opinion, does the publishing industry in Canada have a diversity issue?
Yes, I do. And I guess the way I'd answer that is that I think the struggle in Canadian publishing is always between the powers that be and those that are somewhere below the powers that be. And we, the appearance, I think, at the moment is that there's a lot of diversity, and there's certainly a lot of publishing being done, from minority groups and from marginalized groups in the country. However, it's a lot of it, in my view anyway, a lot of it is words, and the actions don't seem to follow.
Right.
And so, we can look at what really is happening, or we can look what we say is happening, and what we say is happening isn't being borne out with what's happening in the society as a whole.
Right.
So yes, there's diversity, but the effectiveness of that diversity, I'm not so sure about.
Right. So it's almost like a microcosm of what's going on in our Canadian society as a whole, huh?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And publishing always reflects that. I don't think publishing, except for a very small group of publishers, are in any way, in a lot of ways, in any way challenging that. In fact, they embrace it because that's where the most money is.
Right. Always the money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, what started you in the publishing industry? Because you were involved in. Correct me if I'm wrong. You were involved in writing way earlier than you started actually publishing. Like you started the publishing aspect of your career in the early '90s, right?
No, I actually, in terms of publishing, goes way back to the 1970s.
Oh, really?
I was involved with an organization called the Canadian Liberation Movement, which was part of the nationalist movement of the 60s and 70s. And I was a salesperson, and I sold books for NC Press, which was the publishing arm of the Canadian Liberation Movement. And that's where I first got involved in, direct contact with the publishing industry. For example, I was selling, there was a book that was published in 1969, I think, which was the Patriot's Handbook, or it was originally published in French and got translated into English by NC Press. And I sold that book both in French and in English for a number of years.
Right.
And then I got involved in traveling around the country selling books. And then I got a job with another company after NCF Press folded. And when it folded, I set up what is today called Brunswick Books, was then called Fernwood Books,
Right.
doing sales and later distribution of publishers, both from Canada and people like Monthly Review Press and Said Books and Pluto Press and so on and so forth from the UK.
Mhm.
And then we got involved in the first book we tried to publish with a consortium of people, which was Between the Lines Women's Press and a small printing company in Toronto called Muskox Press. And we got together with the rather ambitious attempt to produce an introductory sociology book for courses in Canada.
Right.
It never happened, but we did publish a couple of parts of that book as books. So, my publishing actually goes back to somewhere in the mid-70s.
Right.
Earlier.
Interesting. Now, at a time when it wasn't really popular to publish books about social justice, and you seem to be at the forefront of giving voice to people of color back in like the 90s or even before that, like you're explaining. What's behind that?
Well, the first book that at NC Press, we published a book called Black Canadians by a guy named Tillich. And that, I think, was probably the first attempt in Canada to publish a book that looked at the history of Black people in Canada.
Right.
There weren't very many of them anyway that I know of, and there certainly wasn't any that was a critical look at at Black Canadians' history. So I think that within the kind of rubric of looking for social change, that came naturally, I think, to a certain extent. I mean, how can you talk about social change and not talk about the treatment of minorities and racism and sexism and all of those kinds of things?
Right.
Women's Press and the company I was with at that time, Garamond Press, we became the leading publishers of women's writing, for example.
Right.
Cool.
So all of these things, and what happened is that these, publishing about women and people of color and so on, got introduced by not only us, but other smaller companies. And when the bigger companies saw that they could actually make money out of it, they didn't give a shit whether they published about, racism or not. But if racism made money for them, they did it. They did it.
Right.
Yeah.
Isn't that always the way, though? Isn't it? Isn't that always the way?
Capitalist system works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True. It always comes down to the money.
Yeah.
And and I look back over my publishing career, the number of books that got introduced by small radical publishers that later became, like, for example, at one point in the game, we published, some of us smaller publishers published practically all the work on women that was published in Canada. Today, everybody's doing it.
Yeah, everyone's doing it.
Because it'll sell.
Yeah.
No, I'm not saying they're all bad, but
but yeah, money drives it. Money drives
driving force. So, what made you move to the North End of Halifax?
Well, I was living in Toronto, and I had come down a year earlier to doing a master's degree at St. Mary's University, and as you know, Lindsay came with me.
Mm-hmm.
And when Lindsay and I came down here, we lived down on Brunswick Street, actually, in a rooming house there, and we lived there for a year. And then I came back to Toronto for a year, and in the meantime, I had met Beverly, and basically, when we went back to Toronto, I went back because I basically had told people I'd be back, and I felt an obligation to come back for a year. So I spent the year kind of getting things straightened out in Toronto, or getting my mind, getting me straightened out in Toronto.
Right.
And we actually wanted to live outside of Halifax, but we bought the place on Creighton Street. Well, partly because we could afford it. And
Right.
of course, that is and was and still is part of the gentrification of the North End of Halifax.
Right.
We couldn't afford to buy a place in the South End or in the West End or whatever. That was the place that we could afford. So we moved in. We weren't fully aware of what the situation was in Creighton Street in the North End of Halifax when we moved in.
Mm-hmm.
However, we lived there for 5 years, and I will always remember living there because we had a good relationship with our neighbors. We got involved in doing some community stuff, sports stuff, and a vacant lot that was across the street from us at that time. That's now public, some kind of housing.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was a great experience. Even if on the corner, which is now Buddy Day and Creighton Street, every evening the boys were lined up to sell drugs or sell women or sell whatever they could sell.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I also had a relationship with some of them after a while because they realized I lived in the community. I wasn't a customer, so they could talk to me like a human being.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the one beautiful thing, I mean, I didn't grow up in the North End, spent a lot of time there when I was a young kid going to Cornwallis Street Baptist Church, but no matter what was going on, there was always that sort of sense of community, you know?
Oh, God, yeah. It was quite amazing. And the, you know, the thing that I always thought about it was that, you know, in spite of the fact that we got robbed a couple of times in the process, I think there was a real acceptance by the community with people like us once they saw that we were trying to be supportive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, true.
I've always found that with the Black community. I mean, there's an appreciation for a white guy like me actually being sympathetic to, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, totally.
I think I remember, I don't know if Lindsay remembers this, but I was walking to because my grandmother lived a few doors down from where you were on Creighton Street.
Yeah.
And ran into Lindsay and we were walking across the commons, walking home. And I asked him, "Where are you going?" And he's like, "I'm going home." I said, "Where do you live?" And like I remember having that conversation years ago, and he said, "Oh, it's on Creighton Street there." But yeah, great memories of that house and me and Jay and Lindsay and a couple friends sitting in your backyard there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But you see, Lindsay used to have to. He went to school in the South End.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Goresbrook, right? I think
Goresbrook, and we were living on Brunswick Street, so that wasn't the closest school, but I was going over there every day to university, and it was convenient that way. But at that point, I wasn't sure I wanted to register Lindsay in the school in the North End.
Mm-hmm.
He was a 13-year-old cocky little white guy from Toronto who not only thought he was superior because of his race, but because of where he came from.
Yeah.
You know, after all, Toronto's the center of the universe. And
yeah.
I was afraid that he wouldn't make out so well. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, he did well.
But he used to go out to the commons to meet his people that he knew from Gorsebrook had escort them down to Creighton Street because they wouldn't walk down to Creighton Street without his escort.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Man.
Yeah, the Commons, the gateway to
The
different
gateway.
portals of the city.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned, of course, your sort of social justice spirit was kind of always naturally there. You actually, speaking of social justice, you struck up a friendship with Rocky Jones, who, if for people who don't know, he was a civil rights activist in the 60s in Halifax, speaking about Black rights and stuff like that. But you ended up publishing a book or two about him and also having a close personal friendship. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, and if you asked me when I met Rocky, I couldn't tell you because Rocky was quite a visible figure around Halifax, and if you were involved in progressive stuff and meetings and community organizations, inevitably Rocky showed up, and I just kind of got to know him through that, right? And then later, spent time chatting with Rocky and visiting him at his house and so on. We often talked about political stuff because I often got the feeling that Rocky, even with his own family to some extent, never could get into that kind of discussion because, so I always felt he was quite happy to be able to have that kind of a discussion because Rocky was a revolutionary. He wasn't, and while he was incredibly loyal to his family and to the Black community at some level, in his own thinking and his own, he was in a different place in terms of, what he, but that never separated them from it. So over that period of time, we got to know one another, and then when him and names always fall.
We believe that Errol's talking about James Walker, professor of history at Waterloo.
Do a biography of Rocky and spent a lot of time doing interviews and stuff with Rocky. Rocky wanted us to do the book.
Excellent.
And so it never did get done in his lifetime. That book actually didn't come out until a couple of years after Rocky died.
Yeah.
But when it was when George Eliot Clark and his name will come to me, and then from the University of Waterloo. This is old age talking.
It's all good.
It's all good. Yeah.
Anyway, they came to me and we decided to do the book. And I've always thought that I think it would have been a different book had Rocky been alive.
Right.
But that's the way it is.
Yeah.
And, that's how I got involved in any event. And it was a great honor for us to publish Rocky, the book on Rocky, because he was an important figure. Very important. Not only was that book about Rocky, that book, as I have said to many people and tried to say to people in universities, for example, in a way, embedded in that book is a history of the Black community in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
Because Rocky was always involved in political activity, but never, ever deserted the community.
In keeping with that, what social issues do you believe need more of a voice today?
Yeah, personally, I think we're not really talking about, we talk about social change, but we're not talking about changing the system.
Right.
And if we don't change the system, we're never going to have the kind of social change that we want.
Right.
You take Nova Scotia when it comes to racism. some of the stories that you hear from people like Lynn Jones and other people about their experience of living in Halifax and so on. You look back over the last 30 years and you think a lot of things have happened, a lot more Black people got a voice, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of the time when it comes down to real life, they don't.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, that's poignant. Like, you're right. Like we can talk about it, but the root of the problem is the system itself hasn't changed. And
I'll give you an example. I could give you lots of them, but this is an interesting one. When we did a book with Lynn on reparations, a children's book, and when they were preparing that book, we were giving them an advance to pay for the people that were working on the book and putting it together. And I had written a check to Lynn. And I was sitting at my office one day and the phone rang and it was the bank. They said, "Do you know Lynn Jones?" And I said, "Yes." "Well, she's here with a check from your company." I said, "Yeah, so." and well, can we cash it? I said, "Well, why wouldn't you?" I knew the answer to that question, of course. And in all of my years in writing checks to banks, they bounced a few, but they never called me and asked me if the person that was there to cash that check was a legitimate customer.
Wow. Yeah.
And I said to them, why? Well, of course, they wouldn't say, you understand what I mean?
yeah,
But it was quite clear. And I remember calling Lynn afterwards and asking her, but she knew, of course, because she was there. And she just, Lynn kind of, at one level, kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, "Oh, well, that happens every day."
yeah,
Well,
and
it don't happen to me every day. And it was quite an experience to have to, realize that. So those kind of experiences help you realize how incredibly deeply entrenched racism is in our society, and not only in the society but in people like me. And I've many times in my own thinking tried to imagine what it's like to grow up like you guys. I have some clues, but I never experienced that. And out of my experience and out of the experience of many people, white people, we react out of that experience, if you understand what I mean.
yeah, definitely.
And sometimes what we do, we realize later, isn't what we really wanted to do anyway, but it happened because that's where we came from.
Yeah, no, it's there are a lot of well-meaning people out there that are floundering around when it comes to social issues. I definitely agree. But as I was telling my daughter yesterday, the way to deal with your friends that are not of color is to ask them to listen.
Yeah.
Just listen to people who are talking about their experiences, and it's not a natural thing for people just to listen and take in, because we want, like you said, we want to relate our experiences with the person's experience, and it's well-meaning.
Yeah,
definitely.
I remember this. I'll tell you stories because that's what I do. I remember one time I was talking with Rocky, and we were talking about racism or something related to it. I don't know the details of it now, but Rocky said, "Errol, come here," and he stood me up in front of a mirror, and he said, "What do you see?" And I said, "I see my face." And he said, "Well, I see mine when I look in that mirror too, but what happens when you step outside of this door, my house?" your face is not seen, but mine's seen by everybody that walks by.
Mm.
And I kind of sat there and thought, shook my head a few times, and because I can walk out there and just feel that I'm a random person wandering down the street. He walked out there and he was not a random person walking down the street, and everybody was aware of his presence.
Yeah. Yeah. There's
Mhm.
sometimes, unintentionally there's a target,
Yeah.
For sure.
and
Yeah.
like you say, it's so deeply entrenched in thought and ways of past that we can never seem to break the cycle. And the status quo is always kept because, like you say, sometimes the powers of be will always have an agenda, even beyond of trying to do what's technically right, just to keep their status quo alive. But that's the problem of all those systems, what we were built on, great countries and stuff like that, but not really, in my personal opinion,
Yeah.
when it comes to those issues.
Well, most white people won't say this, I don't think, but we were brought up to believe that you were inferior,
Mm.
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
were less than human, or at least less than us as humans.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Less than. Yeah.
And that don't just disappear with a flick of a finger.
No.
Mhm.
It's pretty well ingrained in the even people that know, are anti-racist and fight against racism and stuff. It takes a long time for that to, for white people to just actually see a black person or a person of color as another human being,
Mhm.
Yeah.
not one that's categorized in some way.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, this
Yeah.
has been an awesome conversation. Thank you very much for your time. We actually have a surprise for you. Let's see how this works out. Hang on for a second.
Yeah.
We had arranged for our friend and Errol's son, Lindsay, to join our conversation.
Oh God, who the hell's that?
Yeah. Father and son reunited.
Hi, team. How are you?
Lindsay,
Hi.
how you doing, man? Thanks for
I'm
joining
doing
us,
Very
man.
good. Good. Nice to see y'all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
man.
Seen
How
you
you-
for a while, Lindsay. Your beard's looking good.
Yeah, well, it's a
And-
little
and
cold
look-
for
look, he's
trim at
got-
the moment. So.
He's also got, his hair hasn't changed color, but his beard has, and that's
Yeah.
exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
So he can't escape.
It's inevitable.
But it hasn't worked.
It's in the genes.
We've never had to do a DNA test to confirm our paternity. I don't think.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that is.
No. Well, we've had a great conversation with your father, Lindsay. Oh my goodness, man.
Yeah.
You guys are great. Like, it does brought a lot of memories back about Creighton Street. And as I told your father, sitting in your backyard, they're trying to make sure when I would leave your house, I'd look both ways and make sure my grandmother wasn't walking down the street. Because usually we had a few fuzzy pops there in your backyard, man.
Yeah. On more than one occasion. And even times when you weren't there. No one was home.
I think it's possible your grandmother might not have wanted you hanging out with me and Errol at the time, too, quite frankly. But I'm awfully glad you did, because that worked out really well. So.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely, man. No, definitely. It was great to hook up there. But do you guys have anything to say before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say, obviously you both of us, the three of us have talked about this a fair bit, but Errol and I have even had a couple conversations just about how much reflection and stuff I did leading into the interview I did with you guys. But since then too, I've obviously listened to a lot of all of the podcasts, but it's really engaged my mind again in stuff that, as I've been here for so long, I've kind of disengaged a little bit in Halifax, and I find myself, reading a lot more local stuff there again, trying to stay in touch with, what is still my community, despite where I am geographically.
Of course.
And so I thank you guys for that, because for sure, you were the kind of impetus for that engagement, for sure.
Awesome.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, it's taken me down a rabbit hole as well. Like right now I'm kind of doing some research on my family, and and it's like kind of really amazing to see how far it goes back and what, you know, who they were in the community and all these relatives that I'm related to and who try to do a lot of social change. So, you know, you can't help but look at it and go, wow. So but it invigorates your feeling for the community you grew up in. At least that's where my
100%,
head's at, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you mentioned your family, and I've become much more aware of the kind of impact of your family since you and I started talking. I mean, I obviously have known a bunch of your relatives off and on, and Errol has worked with a bunch of them and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But it is crazy. I mean, the history of your family in Nova Scotia is pretty wild, man.
Yeah,
Deep and
yeah.
long, and, you know, it's got breadth, as they say. So.
Yeah.
One thing I'd say about Lindsay is that his awareness of a lot of these issues like racism and inequality and stuff like that was much more keen when he left Halifax than it was when he came.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we spoke about that. I mean, it's seeing it unfold in such a stark reality is so different than conceptualizing it is one thing. You know, I didn't live it, but I lived in it, if you know what I mean, right? You know, I'm fortunate, you know, but I was in the neighborhood and I certainly saw how my neighbors and my friends got treated in the neighborhood, right? It was eye-opening. It was no shit.
But one of the things that struck me when I first came to Halifax, you know, I'd been involved in a whole bunch of stuff in Toronto as part of parents' movement and stuff, and a lot of the stuff around equity and the school community relations group at the Board of Education and all of that kind of stuff. And there certainly was all kinds of racism in Toronto of one kind or another. But when I came to Halifax, the segregation of Halifax struck me in a way that segregation didn't strike me in Toronto. You know, there was more mixing of people, but in Halifax, when we first met there, if you saw a Black person south of Spring Garden Road, you knew they were a student.
Yeah.
Because the people that lived there didn't cross that street. That was a no-no, you know, for the most part. And you know, the segregation of the community, which I and Beverly and consequently Lindsay had inadvertently moved into. You know, was an incredible thing for me in terms of realizing the reality of you know living in a racist society like Halifax. You know, Halifax being called the Mississippi of the North, as you've heard. And in a real sense it is. And in a real sense, that's still true in Halifax. And what's happening today is gentrification, of course, is driving a lot of the Black people out of the North End because they can no longer afford to live there. And, you know, I've heard people like Lynn Jones, for example, say, I used to be able to walk down Cottage Street and feel safe. I don't feel as safe anymore, was what they said, because you know it's become gentrified. But even when we lived there, there was only one Black person that worked as a retail person in any of those stores, and that was at the drugstore at the corner of Kennard and Cottage.
No, that's a valid point. I you know, in looking back, like living it, you're not really aware of it. And you know, living in the North End, I generally didn't go north of the Commons. You know, I didn't go I didn't go south of Spring Garden very often unless I was actually purchasing something or visiting someone very quickly. No, that's very poignant. And years later, just before I left, just a quick story. Me, Jay, and a really close buddy of ours, Chad, we all got, don't ask me why, but we got paper routes as adults. like thinking that it was easy money. Like, so we were delivering papers at like 3 o'clock in the morning, right?
Yeah, good times.
Yeah, I know. But so I meet with the guy, my manager, and it turns out the only territory he had was in the South End. So, the first few times that I'm delivering papers, I'm like, I'm just trying to get through it. I'm tired because I'm not used to being up at that time. And eventually, after a couple of weeks, I'm noticing police cars on my route, like that I hadn't seen before, and like I'm going, what the hell? And then I talked to my father, and my father drove cab for years in Halifax, and I told him what he was doing. He was like, what are you doing that for? And I said, oh, just some extra cash. It's great. He said, and where? And I said, in the South End. He said, you better be careful. Yeah. And I actually had to ask him, what are you talking about? He said, you're a young black man in the South End at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Derek, I went to, in 1982, it would have been in May, the Learneds were held at Dalhousie University. The Learneds is the organization where all the intellectuals they call it the Congress today. They got a little bit more humble. But, the academics from all over the country get together to share their learned papers. And as publishers, we were there with our books, displaying the books to the meeting. Mm-hmm. We were told, now there was a police strike in Halifax that year, but we were told at a public meeting not to go to the North End.
Really?
Wow.
And these were people that were coming from all over Canada that were situated, that were at Dalhousie University, which was within 20-minute walking distance, as you know, from the North End. And we were told it was not safe for us to be there.
Really?
And I remember 2 or 3 of us did take a walk out to Goddington to try and find out what the danger was.
That's how you learn.
That's how you learn.
I just wanted to add one little quick thing here. It's this story that Errol experienced, actually. They told me many, many moons ago. When we were living on Creighton Street, and my brother was in town, and there was a young boy from a couple doors down named Richard, and him and my brother were buddies because they were 6 years younger than me, right? And they were hanging out and stuff like that. And one day, my dad was working at St. Mary's at the time, and he had to run down to the South End. And he got, Ian and Richard were playing together, and Errol said, hey, Richard, do you want to come along? He's, oh, sure, let me check with my mom, gets permission, comes out, and away he goes. I guess I should add that, Richard was a young African-Canadian guy, right? Because there's context to that, obviously. And as they're driving down towards St. Mary's, they go to cross Spring Garden Road, and Richard kind of starts freaking out and goes, Errol, like I'm not allowed to go past Spring Garden Road. And my dad at the time was totally like, well, what do you mean? And then he says, my mom has always told me it's not safe for me to be in that part of town. And it was such a totally different way of thinking about it. Because the whole time I had been in Nova Scotia, everything had always been juxtaposed about white people being, victims in the North End. And here's this very young guy, like at the time, maybe 11 or something like that.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that light was shone for me, where it was like, oh, right. If you flip this on his head, it's actually way more risky for a young black guy to be in the South End than it is for a young white guy to be in the North End, right? Which I found very illuminating at the time.
Yeah. I mean, it was something I never really thought about, in all my years, really. I mean, when I was a younger kid, yes, because, the N-word was being thrown around, from kids in school and stuff. And, until I got acclimated in my community, growing up in mostly white community in Klein Heights in the Spryfield area. Once I got acclimated to that community, I didn't really fear about being black because I felt like I had kind of toughened up being there. And then, I'd spend so much time in the North End at church, and I felt like I had both words covered, and I felt safe. So but really I probably wasn't just because I didn't think like that.
I just going back to what Lindsay said about the young fella coming over to St. Mary's. I took him for a little drive around the South End after you cross, the deep South End, where all of the big houses are.
Yeah.
And I never saw a young fella so surprised before or since.
Yeah.
He said, "How many people live in those houses?" I said, "Well, maybe a nuclear family, a man, a woman, one of children." I mean,
less than your 2-bedroom apartment.
In a one-room apartment, there were 7 of them in one room.
Yeah.
And, I mean, he said, "I don't believe you," and I said, "It's true." I mean, that's the difference between where you live on Creighton Street and where these people live. What is it? Half-hour walk?
Yeah, if that.
Not even.
If that.
Crazy.
And I just thought, and I'd traveled a bit, I'd seen some stuff, but he just was absolutely flabbergasted that this actually happened as close to where he lived as he did.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Gentlemen, this has been awesome.
Guys.
Fantastic. Jay Jones, why don't you take us out, man?
Yeah, man. I mean, it was great. It's great to see Lindsay, who was an excellent guest last year. And now, Errol, thanks for coming on. And it's good to see where Lindsay gets his candor from and his sense of spirit. And it's just a really good conversation to have, to know about our history once again through different eyes. And these conversations are important. This is how we sort of change things, I believe, at least us being conscious of what we're actually talking about and the way we can consciously live within these issues that we see and that we continue to see. So thanks for shining light on that, guys. And Derek, as always, down home is in the house.
Hey, thank you, Jason.
Cheers, guys. Have a great day. We'll see you guys soon, all right?
Hey,
Yeah.
wonderful.
All right.
Take it easy,
Bye-bye.
guys. Thanks.
Breaking new ground, breaking new ground, breaking new ground.
You have been listening to Down Home. Subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Breaking new ground, 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 yeah. On a high plateau, from the one down below to the future of the funk, getting lost in the flow. Contact with the spark magex. Now it's time to flex with the force from the soul, reaching all aspects, getting deep, no time to sleep. As you reach your next phase, laying it all on the line. New trail start to blaze. It's a fire inside.
The song Breaking New Ground from The Breakdown.
Boy, just kicking it live. A connection so strong, transcribe with the vibe like magic prescribed. Only to see the perfect blend like a diamond in the rough.